Hello again. Welcome to this webinar by the Science-Based Targets Initiative about science-based target setting for the building sector. My name is Jun Kim, and I am the Stakeholder Engagement Manager at the SBTi, and I will be your host for this webinar today. As some of you may be aware of, on August this year, the SBTi released the Building Sector Science-Based Target Setting Criteria, and this project began in October 2021 and enables companies and financial institutions in the building's value chain to set 1.5 aligned emissions reduction targets and also play their part in preventing the catastrophic impacts of climate change. With the expertise of my colleagues from the buildings team, we will be diving into some of the key criteria and target setting methods introduced in the recently released SBTi buildings criteria and responding to frequently asked questions. Yes, thank you. So before we start, a few guidelines for this webinar. So this is a Zoom webinar. Your camera and microphone are automatically muted. And participants can and are encouraged to send questions via the Q&A button. You can submit your questions throughout the webinar, and the team will be providing written answers throughout the session. And we may then address some of the questions in the live Q&A. And slides from this webinar will be published on our website. And also please note that this webinar will be recorded for the benefit of those who cannot attend, and also will be published on the SBTi's YouTube channel. So today's session, this first session, will be translated into Mandarin. You can select your preferred language by clicking on the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. And as mentioned before, these webinars will be recorded and also available with these translations for future viewing on SBTi's Buildings page and YouTube. So the webinar is scheduled for 1 hour, but we expect to get through the content in less than that, leaving time for questions. So we will start with some opening remarks from our Chief Technical Officer, Alberto Carrillo Pineda, and then we will continue with an introduction to the Science-Based Targets Initiative and the Buildings Project, and then an overview of the key criteria introduced in the new Buildings criteria. Then the SBTi's Buildings team will present in detail how in-use and upfront embodied emissions targets are formulated. And at the end of each section, where the team will be diving into the target setting process for in-use and embodied emissions, we will be having live Q&A sessions to respond to frequently asked questions on this topic. And we will finalize with some closing remarks. So to get a better sense of the audience today, let's do a quick poll to learn a little bit more about you and know what interests you most about the buildings criteria. So the question is, what is the area you are the most interested in with regards to the SBTi buildings criteria? And while the poll is running, I'm very pleased to introduce the team working on today's webinar. Alberto Carrillo Pineda, Chief Technical Officer at the SBTi. Ayla Dinchai, the building lead at the SBTi, responsible for leading the project. And Maria Garcia, the technical manager for the buildings project. I will be your host today, and in addition to moderating the Q&A sessions, I will also join you for an introduction to the SBTi and finalize with some closing remarks. But before we start this session, I would also like to thank those working behind the scenes on this project and on this webinar, Stefan Sivek and Paulina Moreno. It's thanks to their work that this webinar is happening. And many thanks also to the colleagues who will be supporting to answer your questions in the Q&A box. So with that, we will now close the first poll. It says that about 60% of you said they understand how science-based target setting works for the building sector. That's a very good number. And about 17% of you said want to learn what the target setting process entails. And also about 18% say that you want to learn how science-based targets will encourage the sector to decarbonize. Okay. So now it's my pleasure to introduce you to SBTi's Chief Technical Officer, Alberto Carrillo Pineda, who will give us some opening remarks. Alberto, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this exciting webinar. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you for joining us today as we dive into one of the most exciting areas in the fight against climate change, which is the decarbonization of the building sector. Buildings represent over one-third of global energy consumption and emissions, and this number shows how important it is the sector in driving climate action. If we are to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, we must transform the way in which we build, we manage, and we operate buildings. Today, we are going to explore the new SBTi buildings criteria, which is a groundbreaking science-based decarbonization framework that provides companies and financial institutions in the buildings value chain with the tools to align their emission reduction targets with climate science. In this session, our team will unpack the key elements of this framework. We'll discuss practical ways to implement and respond to questions on this topic. Beyond the technical details, I want to emphasize why this matters now. As we know, the window of opportunity to limit warming to 1.5 degrees is closing fast, and the building sector has a crucial role to play in the fight against climate change. Our call to action for you is simple. Get involved. Whether you are just starting the journey today or looking to accelerate your decarbonization efforts, the time to act is now. Join us and join the group of forward-thinking companies that are taking science-based climate action, and let's build a future where sustainable buildings are the new norm. Thank you for being here, and we look forward to engaging in an impactful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto, for your insightful words. We will continue to build on this throughout the webinar. Let's start with a brief introduction to the SBTi, what science-based targets are, and the target setting approaches. The Science-Based Target Initiative was formed as a collaboration between the 5 organizations that you can see at the bottom of your screen. In 2023, the SBTi was incorporated as a charity in the UK with a subsidiary which will host our target validation services. We mobilize companies and financial institutions worldwide to take the lead on urgent climate action by setting greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets that are aligned with what is needed to keep global heating below catastrophic levels and also reach net zero by 2050 at the latest. We do this by developing resources so companies and financial institutions understand how much and how quickly they need to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to prevent the worst effects of climate change, and also access and validate companies and financial institutions' targets through our validation services arm. So what are science-based targets? Our corporate net zero standard lays out the full framework. Net zero targets are made up of 4 elements. So the first is 1.5 aligned near-term target. That is a target with a time frame of 5 to 10 years. The second is a long-term target, a target to reduce emissions to residual level by 2050 or sooner. That is an over 90% reduction compared to today's emissions. And the third element on the screen is optional but recommended. So rapid and deep cuts to value chain emissions must be the overarching priority for companies. However, this does not mean that actions beyond the value chain cannot have value to help reduce emissions in other parts of the economy and accelerate the global net zero transformation. Therefore, the businesses are encouraged to embark on this as voluntary additional action, which we call beyond value chain mitigation, or BVCM. And the fourth and final part is that when a company has achieved its long-term target and cut emissions by more than 90%, it must further commit to reducing those residual emissions through permanent removals from the atmosphere. So a company will only be considered to have reached net zero when it has achieved its long-term science-based target and neutralized any residual emissions. But how should a company calculate how much it needs to reduce emissions for its near-term targets? So the SBTi uses two main target setting methods. The first, the left-hand side of the slide, is used for large homogeneous sectors, such as it is the case with buildings here. And companies are expected to converge towards a sector decarbonization path in terms of carbon intensity. That is kilogram CO2 per square meter in this case. We refer to this method as the sector decarbonization approach. The other method on the right side is used for all other sectors or emission sources and is called cross-sector absolute reduction. It expects all companies to reduce emissions at the same annual rate. And both of these methods are in use in the building criteria. And the application of these methods will be explained later during this webinar as well. So before I hand over to Ayla to take us through the next section of this webinar, I want to open our second poll of the webinar, which asks the question, what type of organization do you represent? And in the next section, Ayla will give an introduction to the SBTi's building project, and we also will go through the same key criteria. So now let's take a look at the poll results first. Okay. So today we have about 40% coming from consulting firms, and about 34% coming from company. We also have about 10% of you guys coming from financial institutions. We also have attendees coming from academia, government, and industry associations as well. Thank you all for participating. And now, Ayla, the floor is yours.
All right, I think I'm live. Thank you, June. I will start with a general overview of the buildings project to lay the groundwork for the rest of the information we will share throughout this webinar. The project can be summarized in three main objectives. The first one is the development of 1.5C aligned pathways for in-use operational emissions of buildings, so that targets reflect variations in local power grids and how buildings are used. The second objective was the development of 1.5C aligned pathways for embodied emissions of buildings to cover the emissions associated with material production and construction processes of new buildings. The third objective was to develop criteria, guidance, and a target-setting tool for the built environment to develop and set greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets within the unique context of the building sector. All companies and financial institutions should start their science-based target-setting journey by familiarizing themselves with the SBTi Corporate Net Zero Standard, the financial institution's near-term criteria, and the explanatory document. These documents provide the basis on which the sector criteria is built on. As part of the buildings project, we have developed the following technical outputs. First one is the buildings criteria. The criteria document includes mandatory criteria that companies in the sector are required to follow when setting science-based targets. Another important document is the building's explanatory document. The explanatory document provides further guidance on how to set targets using the criteria. It does not include new mandatory criteria. Third important document is the embodied emissions pathway development description. This document provides background information on how the embodied emissions pathways were developed. The last document listed on this slide is the building's target setting tool. This tool has been developed to help businesses in developing their emissions reduction targets following the sectoral decarbonization approach, or SDA for short, and the sector-specific absolute contraction method. The tool aggregates the targets resulting from the SDA and the absolute contraction method into an overarching company target. In addition to these main technical resources, the SBTi has developed some others to support corporates in their target setting process, and these can be found on the building's webpage. These documents include resources used by the SBTi validation services, such as the building's criteria assessment indicators. The SBTi building sector criterion brief, which provides an overview of the criteria, key steps for target setting, and answers some frequently asked questions. Additionally, we have shared background documents explaining the development processes over the course of the SBTi buildings project. Next, I will give you a short overview of the criteria and present the key criteria. This slide provides an overview of all the criteria and recommendations introduced in the buildings criteria. We have a total of 14 criteria and 10 recommendations. Today, due to the time constraints, we will focus on some of the key criteria to start the target setting process. First, we will take a look at the 3 criteria for companies to determine whether they are in the scope of this criteria. Then we will delve into the target setting methods that companies and financial institutions in the building's value chain are required to use when developing targets. We will then explain what the whole building approach means, what are the required scope 3 categories that companies and financial institutions are required to account for in their targets, and what the no new fossil fuel equipment commitment means. We spend most of our lives in buildings. Also, most companies need buildings for their business operations. Due to the relevance that buildings have in our daily lives and the impact on climate change, it was paramount to define thresholds and criteria to filter companies and financial institutions with substantial amounts of emissions coming from buildings to set targets following the buildings criteria. The buildings criteria approaches this through 3 aspects. First one is the share of the in-use operational emissions in the GHG inventory. Second one is the share of upfront embodied emissions of new buildings in the GHG inventory. And third one is the business activities that are specific to the sector. For in-use operational emissions, the threshold is set to be 20%. This means that if in-use operational emissions from owned and/or managed buildings are at least 20% of total scopes 1, 2, and 3, category 1 to 14 emissions in the chosen base year, companies need to set a sector-specific target on in-use operational emissions, and they need to follow the buildings criteria. For upfront embodied emissions from new developments or acquisitions of a building as a first owner, the threshold is set to be 20%. This means that if upfront embodied emissions of new buildings exceed 20% of total scopes 1, 2, and 3, category 1 to 14, in any of the past 3 years, companies need to set targets on upfront embodied emissions of new buildings, and they need to follow the buildings criteria. As you know, the buildings sector value chain consists of a broad array of actors. Influence and responsibility of emissions from buildings are split between various actors, making stakeholder engagement crucial in succeeding in climate action. For example, when constructing a new building, manufacturers are involved in producing materials like steel and concrete. Architects and designers play a role in the building's design, while construction companies are involved during the building phase. Once the building is operational, owners, whether they are occupiers or lessors, and property managers handle day-to-day operations of the buildings. Occupants are present during the building's usage, and eventually companies working with the construction and renovation come into play. While all these companies operate within the same sector with the same buildings, they do not benefit from the same target setting approaches. For some businesses, the sector-agnostic methods in the corporate net zero standard provide already a clear target setting framework, and in that case, they are not among the intended users of the building's criteria. During the development process of the building's criteria, we identified the following businesses to benefit from the SDA targets and the sector-specific absolute reduction targets, and consequently, they are defined as the intended users of the criteria. These user types are developers, owners, both occupiers and lessors, property managers, and financial institutions with buildings-related emissions in categories 1 to 14. These intended user types are required to use the building's criteria when they meet the thresholds laid out in buildings C1 and C2 that I just introduced before this slide. Other companies in the value chain are encouraged to set targets using the existing SBTi cross-sector methods or other sector criteria if relevant. Next, I will move to the target setting methods permitted in the building's criteria. The building's criteria introduces 2 new target setting methods for the sector using the methodologies introduced earlier in this webinar by June. The first one is the sector-specific intensity convergence method, or the sectoral decarbonization approach, the SDA, for in-use operational emissions and upfront embodied emissions of new buildings, and the sector-specific absolute reduction method that can be used for upfront embodied emissions of new buildings. These permitted target setting methods are dependent on the user type and emissions categories. Businesses must select the user type that best describes their business activity and use all relevant criteria to set targets. We will get back to these methods later in this webinar, but first, I would like to introduce you to 2 new criteria in the building's GHG accounting and target boundaries. So this slide shows an example of the target mapping flowcharts included in the building's criteria with the aim to help users in understanding how to apply the criteria effectively and which methodologies are applicable. Before deep diving into other criteria, let's take a quick look at this example flowchart. In this case, we have an example for owner-lessor. First, at the top, in the first level of the flowchart, we identify the user type, owner-lessor in this case. Next, moving down to the second level, users can identify the building's related emissions on a high level. Then, based on the type of emissions, companies will find the applicable methodologies and tools in the third level. At this stage, the flowchart uses colors to guide you to the relevant documents. Purple refers to the SBTi buildings criteria and the buildings target setting tool. That is the topic of this webinar today. Orange color points you to the SBTi corporate standard and the cross-sector target setting methods for broader corporate targets. So based on the color, you will know which criteria and tools to refer to when setting targets. You can find these flowcharts for each user type and further details in the criteria document. And then moving to buildings C6, So one of the important concepts included in the buildings criteria is the whole building approach. Companies must use this approach when accounting and setting SDA targets for in-use operational emissions. Following the greenhouse gas protocol, companies have to account and allocate in-use operational emissions to different scopes in their inventory as usual. However, for target setting purposes, companies are required to follow the whole building approach, which means they need to aggregate all in-use operational emissions across all scopes into a single total. The criterion C8 requires certain scope 3 categories to be included in the target boundary. The required emissions categories have been determined based on the relevance of each intended user's known business activities, the applicability of individual target setting methods, and the company's level of influence over associated emissions reductions. The details of which emissions shall be included within each user's target boundary are provided in Buildings Criterion C8. For developers, this means the categories where upfront embodied emissions are accounted for. And for owner lessors, it means categories where tenants' operational emissions are included, usually category 13, downstream leased assets. These categories need to be included in the target boundary, irrespective of whether the general threshold as defined in the corporate net zero standard for scope 3 targets are met. However, companies may need to set additional scope 3 targets if the building's specific targets do not meet the required scope 3 coverage as defined in the corporate net zero standard. Before moving forward to the in-use operational target setting, I will present one more criterion. As an additional commitment, companies required to use the SBTi buildings criteria must publicly commit to install no new fossil fuel equipment that is owned or financially controlled by the company in their buildings portfolios from 2030 at the latest. This commitment means that when current fossil fuel installations reach the end of their lifetime, they would not be renewed, but instead substituted with technologies that do not demand fossil fuels on site. This commitment is to ensure that companies do not lock in carbon in future by investing in fossil fuel technologies that could be substituted. This commitment applies to systems used for heating, cooking, power generation, and hot water in both new and existing buildings. Companies may provide additional context for their commitment as part of their annual reporting. This information or the delivery of the commitment are not validated by the SBTi. However, the commitment language is disclosed together with the company's targets. Before I hand over to Maria to take us through the next section of this webinar, I want to open our third poll of the day, which asks the question, where is your organization based? And while you respond to the poll, I'd like to let you know that in the next section, Maria will drive us through the in-use operational targets. However, before that, let's take a look at the results first. And looking at the results, we can see that majority of you, 61%, are based, or your organization is based in Europe, followed by companies based in Asia with 23% presence. We also have participants from Africa, North America, and Oceania, which is great. Happy to have you here. Thank you. Thank you for participating. And now, Maria, over to you.
Thank you, Ayla. The in-use operational pathways that has been included in the building target setting tool cover the operational, energy use, and fugitive emissions from refrigerants and cooling systems. These 1.5 degrees pathways were developed in collaboration with the Carbon Risk Real Estate Monitor, better known as CREM. These pathways are very granular and offer specific solutions for different buildings typologies and in different countries and regions. The whole building approach, which was introduced earlier, applied to these pathways. Therefore, targets developing using these pathways cannot be set without the whole building emissions data. For more information on the methodologies behind these pathways, you can visit the CREM website. Next, I will go through the target setting methods applicable for these emissions. All intended users of the building's criteria specified in criterion C3 are required to use sector-specific intensity converged approach, also known as the SDA method. Note that developers are in brackets because if the developer meets the threshold for the in-use operational emissions, it will be classified as an owner or property manager. However, we have two deviations for this general rule. The first one, financial institutions can use all methods allowed in the financial institution near-term criteria to set targets on their real estate assets. The building's criteria provide guidance on the SDA targets, which is just one of the methods available. The second one is for property managers that sometimes may not have the whole building emissions data available, which means that they cannot follow the whole building approach. In those cases, they could set targets on their required categories using the 1.5 align methods that are defined in the SBTi corporate net zero standard. The sector-specific methods are described in the building's criteria and the explanatory documents, but for other methods, users will need to refer to the relevant documents, which are the corporate net zero standard and the financial institutions near-term criteria. Now, I'm going to give you an example on how to calculate the in-use operational emissions using the buildings tool. On this slide, you see a screenshot from the buildings tool. This is specifically the in-use near-term targets tab. To start using the tool, you should start in section A1 by selecting your preferred units. The SBTi uses the metric system, but unit conversion is embedded in the tool. Then the relevant geography is selected in section A2. And here we are using Spain as an example. In section A3, the relevant building type is selected. And as you can see from the green OKs, all inputs are correct and the corresponding pathway has been found. In section A4, emissions and activity data are included. In this example, a base year or 2022 is selected. The in-use operational emissions is an aggregation figure for the whole building emissions data. The floor area in the base year is entered, and as a base year, we have selected 2030. To include the floor area in the target year, we have two ways for doing so. For this example, we have selected the fixed market share method, which is an option for companies that are not able to estimate their floor area in the target year. To get as good quality target as possible, projections for floor area should be provided, if possible. Now that we have entered all the data required, we can scroll down to section A5 for the results. In our case, we move to the next slide. In these slides, you can see the target modeling results. The tool calculates both absolute and intensity emissions for the target year, and the respective reduction rate for both as well. For SDA target, we look at the intensity graph on the right-hand side. The yellow curve is the selected CREM SBTi pathway. The blue curve is the company-specific pathway calculated with the SDA for offices in Spain. Based on the calculations, this company's target year intensity is 12.37 kilograms CO2 equivalent per square meter, and the reduction rate is 54.7% per square meter. Most of the companies have a more diverse target setting portfolio with a variety of buildings, types, and regions. And for these cases, the tool provides an option to aggregate targets. Here, you can see a screenshot of the near-term targets aggregator tab with some example data to illustrate how the aggregator works. The data entered in the previous tab is directly provided at the top of the tool, where it can be copied and pasted to be included in the aggregator table. Companies must repeat this process for each portfolio asset with a different combination of building type and/or location. As a default, the aggregator has 20 roles, but users can manually add as many roles as they need. And at the end of the aggregator, you will see the aggregated targets in the gray cells. For this portfolio, the aggregator reduction rate is 59.4%. And now, using the aggregator target reduction rate, companies can formulate their target. In this case, the wording would be as follows. Company X commit to reduce scope 1, 2, and 3 in use operational greenhouse gas emissions of own buildings by 59.4% per square meter by 2030 from a 2022 base year. In the following slides, I will explain two alternative options provided in the buildings criteria for companies that are not unable to set SDA targets, even though the SDA target setting method is the go-to option for most of the organizations. The first special target setting option is called the fixed intensity target, which is developed especially for organizations that have a high turnover in their portfolio. Companies and financial institutions with a high turnover in their portfolios may therefore find that the SDA method is challenging for the following reasons. A reduced ability to effect building improvements due to the short hold periods, the difficulty in collecting complete and accurate whole building use operational emissions data, and a frequent requirement to recalculate targets to regular significant change in the portfolio. Shortly, this means that the company set an induced operational emissions intensity target in line with the induced operational emission pathway for a chosen target year. Target year shall be 5 years from the base year. More details of the methods and conditions to qualify this option are highlighted in the explanatory document in section 6.4.3. Other relevant sector criteria still apply to companies and financial institutions choosing the fixed intensity target method. The second special target setting option is for companies and financial institutions that have already met the emissions intensity required to be aligned with the 2050 sector intensity level. In this case, a company can commit to maintain the base year portfolio. They also commit to only finance and all 1.5 aligned real estate assets. Companies with diverse portfolio can choose the lowest target year intensity of the relevant pathways. And with this slide, I have reached out the end of this section. And now I will hand over to June, who will facilitate a Q&A session to cover questions related to what has been presented so far. Thanks.
Thanks, Maria. So I'm going to pause here to open the room for any questions you may have. But due to the time constraints, I'm afraid that we will only have to cover one question at this time, but be assured that we will have a second Q&A session at the end of this webinar. So the first question we received, this one is for Ayla. For companies who have already set targets, how will these new criteria affect them?
Thank you, June. So companies with validated science-based targets are not required to resubmit under the new criteria. These companies will follow the regular 5-year target review cycle, at which point they will be required to align with the building's criteria. However, they are, of course, encouraged to recalculate ahead of the regular schedule using this criteria.
Thank you, Ayla. Many thanks everyone who had submitted questions so far, and to our experts for shedding some light on this. We are doing our best to answer each one of them, but however, due to the time constraint, if any of them cannot be answered during this session, we invite you to visit SBTi's buildings page to review all the available resources there, as well as keeping an eye out for possible explanatory content that we might be publishing in the future in response to FAQs. So we are now entering the final part of this webinar. But before I hand it over to Ayla, I would like to open the last part of the webinar, which asks the question, what is the status of your company with respect to the SBTi? So in the next section, Ayla is going to present target setting for upfront embodied emissions of new constructed buildings. And for now, let's take a look at the poll lasers first. Sorry, it was very quick poll. So 33% say that my organization has a validated science-based target, and followed by 20% of you say that your organization is considering committing to set a science-based target. And the third one was 20% says that not applicable because of I'm not representing a company. So we have a variety of companies that are in terms of like SBTi status. So thank you all for participating in the poll today. And now, Ayla, over to you.
Thank you, June. So in this section, I will introduce you to the target setting of for upfront embodied emissions. The upfront embodied emissions pathways cover modules A1 to A5 in a building's life cycle for new construction measured at practical completion. A1 to A3 cover product stage, which is raw material supply, transport, and manufacturing. Stage A4 covers the transport of the products to the construction site, and A5 covers the construction of the building. The embodied emissions pathways are global, and they have 3 different building types as well as other pathways. When using these pathways for target setting, the life cycle assessment scope shall include at least structural elements, building envelope, internal walls, and finishes. Considering including technical equipment in the assessment scope is also recommended. Methodologies behind these pathways are described in detail in the separate pathway development description document, which can be found in the SBTi's buildings webpage. Next, I will go through the target setting methods applicable to these pathways. Targets on upfront embodied emissions are required for owners when they are first owners of new buildings and for developers. For financial institutions, setting embodied targets for financed emissions is not currently required, which is why they are in brackets. There are 2 main sector-specific target setting options to cover these emissions. First one is the sector-specific intensity convergence approach, also known as the SDA, and the sector-specific absolute reduction method. These methods are only applicable when embodied emissions are reported in the inventory upon completion in Scope 3 Category 2 capital goods. If embodied emissions are reported in different scopes and categories, usually on an annual basis, 1.5C aligned methods must be used as provided in the SBTi corporate net zero standard. The sector-specific methods are described in more detail in the buildings criteria and the explanatory document. For other methods, please refer to the corporate net zero standard or financial institutions near-term criteria. Next, I will share an example on how upfront embodied absolute reduction targets are formulated using the buildings target setting tool. Setting SDA targets for upfront embodied emissions of new buildings follows a similar structure as for in-use operational SDA targets that Maria explained in the previous section, which is why we look at absolute reduction target now. To start using the tool, companies must go to section A1 in the in-use targets tab to select the preferred units. And then we shift back to the embodied targets tab, which is shown on this slide. In section B2, the sector-specific target setting approach is selected as we calculate the target using the absolute contraction that is chosen. This method locks the building type selection in B1. In section B3, emissions and activity data is entered. In this example, a 2020 base year is selected. Upfront embodied emissions include emissions from modules A1 to A5 in the building's life cycle, similar to the pathways. Preferred target year is provided. In this example, it's 2030. Now that we have entered all the data required for calculation, we can scroll down to section B4 for results. In this slide, you can see the target modeling results. As we selected the sector-specific absolute reduction method, the tool calculates only absolute emissions and a respective reduction rate. As we now developed an absolute reduction target, the intensity graph on the right-hand side does not give a curve. Based on the calculations, this company's target year absolute emissions should be reduced by 20.9% in absolute terms. Now, using the calculated reduction rate, this company can formulate its target. In this case, the wording would be as follows. Company X commits to reduce absolute Scope 3 upfront embodied GHG emissions of new buildings by 30.9% by 2030 from a 2020 base year. With this, we are at the end of this section, and I would like to hand over back to June to facilitate a live Q&A and respond to questions that you have submitted.
Thank you, Ayla. So we will early open the room so you can ask any questions you may have. So we received many questions. Thank you everyone for submitting all those questions. So we have first question, which is for Maria. When submitting target, can companies select just one user category, or is it possible to choose multiple categories?
Thanks for your question, Jung and the participants. As per the criterion C3, companies shall apply the relevant target setting criteria for all intended users types that are applicable for their business activities.
Thank you, Maria. We also received a question. This one is for Ayla. Why architecture and engineering companies are not included in the final criteria?
Thank you for the question. The buildings project did explore architecture, engineering, and construction companies as part of the project. However, the sector-specific target setting methods that we have now presented were not applicable for these business models, which is why the final criteria does not include any requirements for these companies. This is a similar case for material manufacturers. They are encouraged to use cross-sector methods or other sector guidance or criteria, if relevant, to set science-based targets.
Thank you, Ayla. So this is an interesting question. How to set targets on embodied emissions from renovations? This question is for Maria.
Yeah, thank you. While the buildings criteria does not provide any new target setting methods for the embodied emission in renovation, retrofit, or refurbishment, companies are required to provide a comprehensive greenhouse gas inventory. And to set targets on these emissions, companies need to use the cross-set methods in the corporate net zero standard. Are all details about that.
Thank you, Maria. We received a question about in-use operational targets. This question is for Ayla. When using the building's target setting tool, in the graphics in section A5 for in-use near-term targets, why do the company STA pathway and CRAM pathway show different ledgers for the same building's type and location?
Thank you for this question. So in the SBTi buildings target setting tool, we use the sectoral decarbonization approach, the SDA methodology, which creates customized decarbonization pathways based on building typology, regional factors using the CREM pathways, but we also apply company-specific information, the base year performance, as well as the projected growth. And as a result, the reduction trajectories in the SBTi buildings tool for the company may differ from the CREM pathway. However, both the SDA targets and the CREM pathways convergence to the same level by 2050. So it's the methodological choice. And if interested in these differences between the SBTi and CREM, we did publish a document called CREM SBTi collaboration and pathway application, which outlines the technical collaboration between both organizations in developing these CREM SBTi 1.5C aligned pathways. This document is available on the buildings webpage.
Great. Thank you, Ayla. We have another question. Says, can we use both the location-based and market-based GHG accounting approaches when setting an in-use operational SDA target under the SBTi buildings criteria? This one is for Maria.
Thanks. Yeah, under the SBTi buildings criteria, companies are recommended to use the location-based approach when setting in-use operational SDA targets in Scope 2. If a company uses the market-based approach, they must also report their emissions using the location-based approach as a mandatory disclose in their annual greenhouse gas inventory. For Scope 3 emissions, companies must use the location-based approach for consistency and transparency.
Thank you, Maria. Yes, we are receiving many questions. So the next question is for Ayla. When using the buildings target setting tool, this one is for Maria. So can we use both the location-based and market-based GHG accounting approaches? Sorry, there are many questions, so I'm like scrolling. This one is for Maria. Is there a place where I can find definitions of terms and acronyms used in SBTi's technical resources?
Thank you. It's true. A lot of questions raised. And for this one, the SBTi create a glossary that provides a comprehensive list of terms, acronyms that we use in our technical resources. You can find the link of the glossary in the SBTi Buildings Explanatory Document and as well in the SBTi website.
Thank you, Maria. This is going to be the last question we can answer during this Q&A session. Does the SBTi buildings criteria cover roads, bridges, tunnels, and other types of infrastructure? Ayla, could you answer to this one, please?
Yes, of course. So the buildings criteria is not intended to cover infrastructure activity. So companies in that sector or companies with emissions from those activities would need to refer to cross-sector methods to develop targets.
Thank you. Thank you all for submitting your questions and to our experts for their thorough explanation. And we are coming to the end of the presentation. So before we wrap up today, we would like to remind you that all the resources introduced during this webinar and more can be found on the SBTi Buildings webpage. And SBTi's building criteria is now final and ready to be used for target setting. And we are already experiencing the devastating impact of climate change, and things will get worse if we do not act now. So businesses across the building's value chain have a unique responsibility and opportunity to lead the natural transformation by setting science-based reduction targets in line with SBTi's buildings criteria. So we urge you to take this next step, embrace the challenge, and set ambitious emissions reduction targets and be part of the solution. So the path to a sustainable, resilient future starts with each of us. So let's act now. Thank you all for your time today.